Hi, I'm Tom from Nightingale Games, and today I'll be talking about War Room, a Larry Harris game. It's January 2020, and I've got 15 topics here to go over that mostly revolve around overlooked rules. And so let's get started. Before I begin, I wanted to mention this is probably the most frequently confused point when setting up. These little mysterious flag of black tokens here, there's 7 square ones and 7 round ones, and those are jumbo national flags. So normally, originally we're just going to use these little round chits to mark your position on the homeland status track in your turn order, but we upgraded to these plastic bits, and so that's where you'll take these stickers and apply the flags which don't have the numbers so it's not a command, it's just a flag. And again, the round ones are for the turn order and the square ones are for the homeland status track. These white markers are the multipliers, and they're intentionally left blank so you can have them represent any multiplier, but stack limits still apply as if they're for whatever they're representing. So you can't just have one of these and have it represent only one in terms of the stack limit. It represents whatever multiple you're representing it for, so 3 or 4 or 5. And another little note is these card holders. So they bend up at the side so the cards don't flop out, and I recommend just pushing in from the back side rather than trying to pry up the front. So you use your finger and push the back to slip the cards in and out. Japan may require one of the extra blank ones at the beginning of the game because they start with so many. I typically only put the cards that have resources in the card holders and then leave the rest in the nation box. So let's get started on these points. The first one is force advantage. Let's talk about force advantage. So here is the battle board. We've got the naval side and the land side, and there is a little summary of force advantage on the battle board itself, but I guess it's still confusing when you're first learning it. So the most important thing to remember is that it does not apply to the air stage. In battles, there are 2 stages, the air stage and the surface stage. And the air stage is conducted first, and then in between the air stage and surface stage is the strategic bombing, and then there's the surface stage. And one way to think about what the air stage means is everything firing at units that are in the air. The target is the air. And then during the surface stage, everything is firing at everything on the surface, including air units. So that means that since you do not even determine whether there is force advantage until the surface stage, anti-air, all these anti-air units, their blacks and whites are going to be effective against the air. So you roll all these dice at the same time. So you're going to roll the anti-air from the surface and the air from any units up here against the enemy. And then after that is resolved, lost units will not participate in the surface battle. And so it's the same for the land. The anti-air is going to fire at the same time against the air during the air battle. And then finally, after that's concluded and any lost units are eliminated, it's at that point at which you compare the number of surface unit types. And if there's a majority, if there's the same, it has no effect and blacks and whites are still effective. But if one side has a majority, the side with fewer types, their black and white results on the dice are considered misses. So if Germany comes with each of the 3 types, it doesn't matter how many you bring, just as long as you bring at least one of that type, it counts as a type. So it's most types you can have in a land surface battle is 3, and the most types you can bring in a battle at sea is 4. There's 4 colors. So the next thing to remember with force advantage is that it's only determined once at the beginning of the battle, of the surface stage battle, and it is not recalculated after batches are rolled or units may be lost. The number of units might change in the course of a battle, but you do not recalculate force advantage. It's only done once. In battles in another round, of course, it would be different at that point. And then just one other little note, someone said that subs aren't really worth even purchasing, but when it comes to force advantage and you need your blacks and whites to sink these capital ships, suddenly the submarines become worth purchasing. Another little overlooked detail is that you'll notice this dive box for the submarines does not have a white triangle, which means you need a yellow to hit it, to eliminate it fully. And if you didn't know the dive rule already, it's if a submarine remains in the dive box after any given batch roll, it escapes from the battle. It, of course, will still have participated because the number of dice you roll are calculated at the beginning of battle and marked with hotspots along this track. And if you had more than 10, you would put multiple hotspots there. So there would be 3 hotspots stacked. If you had 22, there would be 2 hotspots at the 10 and then 1 at the 2. All right, so that is force advantage. You can email warroombulletin@gmail.com or go on our website, nightingalegames.com, and contact us if you have any questions. There's also the Board Game Geek page, which has a forum where it's nice if you post your questions there instead of contacting us directly, because then other people can see the question and answer. So we prefer that you use Board Game Geek rather than contacting us directly. So let's move on to another commonly overlooked rule or misunderstood rule. And we've talked about force advantage and subs. Let's talk about the commander. So the commander makes all the decisions during the battle, even the escort stance and any decision during battle as far as which units to strike. He can also take input from the other allies that are present in the battle, but the commander has ultimate say, and however, the commander after the battle has been resolved, each nation will choose whether or not to repair. So the commander does not make the repair decision. It won't be spending resources of another nation without permission. So a few were confused as to what a row meant. A row is a row. So that means if you have units, let's say you have units in both stances here for the artillery, and that means that the enemy could cause a hit and bring it here, and then cause a hit and bring it here. So you could have 2 damaged artillery at the same time. So you could never have more than 1 damaged artillery in a single row, but each stance is considered its own row. Another commonly overlooked rule is port advantage. While there is a reminder here, I recommend using perhaps the embattled side of a hotspot to remind the bonus and avoid. It just takes a little bit of practice to make that check during the setup for the battle. And you can't have multiple bonuses if there are multiple supporting ports. So you can only ever get +2. It's not per port. However, the enemy could also have a port advantage. So supporting ports for each side. Okay, let's talk about the railroad. So often people forget the railroad penalty when they reach the yellow zone on the Homeland Status track. It says no rail usage or no port advantage. So you probably don't need a reminder to not use the port advantage, but for the rail usage, what we do is put a bomb token, because essentially it's to the same effect, on some of the rails which are not also industries or ports. So that, or you could put them for ports, since ports are ineffective as well at that stage. So that is you are in the yellow zone and cannot use rails, nor your allies. Another point about rails is that air units do not prevent rail usage. So normally you cannot invade by rail, but or you could not even enter a territory if there are enemies present, even if you control it or an ally controls it, and you would have to then cancel your move. So, but however, if the only enemy unit that is blocking is air, and it is also in a territory that you or an ally control, then that's fair game. You may rail there. Air units do not block rail movement. Let's talk about troop transports. So a number of people forget that troop transports can move 2 out to sea. They can move 2 while at sea. So even moving from land, they can go from land to sea, or from sea to sea to sea. So they're such that they're moving 2 spaces. They just cannot move back to land. They cannot make an amphibious invasion unless they are immediately adjacent to the territory in which they are moving to. So they cannot move from land to sea to land. And this is all noted on the inside. If you're using the dry erase, you don't have that movement reminder. I recommend perhaps making a copy and handing that out if there are new players which aren't familiar with the movement rules. Another point with troop transports is that while they are commonly pinned, their pinning value is 0. They can move ashore to a friendly controlled territory, even if it's embattled. So typically this is when they are retreating, but on occasion it might be such that they are defending a territory across, say, the British Channel. But they may not invade an enemy-controlled territory and escape pinning. Let's talk about trades. So, trades, there's a limit of 1 per nation. However, the nation with which they are trading, so let's say Arabia, multiple nations may trade with Arabia. So the neutrals themselves are not limited in the number of trades they may perform, but each playing nation may only perform 1 trade per round. And a trade consists of a single block, and the chart is also on the OMP chart inside cover, or it's on a reference next to Brazil, and it's that exchange 2 oil for 3 iron, or 3 iron for 2 oil. And you cannot, a single trade is just that, 2 oil for 3 iron, or 2 oil for 5 OSR. You cannot do a multiple of that, so you can't trade 6 oil for 15 OSRs, for example. And another point is that trades are only allowed in the global scenario. So it is not even relevant in the Europe scenario or Pacific scenario. Okay, moving on. Convoy raids. So oftentimes people mistakenly count each pip and consider that a hit against a single ship. But if you roll a yellow, you will sink every transport in that cluster. So we use the term cluster to signify these. In the Pacific, there are 2 situations, I believe, where they are sort of blobbed together. So there's 3 circles blobbed together, and that is considered a single cluster. Otherwise, each little grouping with a circle around it is considered its own convoy. And so each command may raid one convoy cluster. But if you roll a blue, you will hit all of those convoy ships, those transport ships, and of course you cannot sink friendly ships. So if one of those transport ships is linked to an allied territory, then you would not be able to deduct that resource from the enemy. Next point is garrisons. So garrison forces. Garrison forces only fire against enemy land units. So not air. So, but on the other hand, you can never claim or capture a territory with only air units. You need land units to capture a territory. So that's a quick point on garrison forces. Next is self-pinning. So this involves naval commands in sea regions. Somebody asked if you could intentionally pin yourself by giving orders to end up in the same region in which you started. And the answer to that is yes. That is a tactic there's nothing saying you can't do that. So, and another point is if there are 2 routes, one is unblocked and the other is blocked, can you choose the one that is blocked? Or must you take the route which is not blocked to your written destination? And the answer is yes. You may take either route and intentionally pin yourself either partially or fully. If you are out of commands, then you must, if you are forced to split because of pinning, for example, and you are out of commands, then you must cancel that order. The units are never lost due to pinning and splitting of a command. Let's talk about invading neutrals. If you invade a neutral and it has defense forces, you don't need to place the command on it immediately. So you can leave it without a command, and it will still belong to a nation which took control of it, or was assigned to it at the time it was invaded. So that means, let's say Germany invades Turkey, for example, and the defense forces rise up. They would immediately align with the nearest nation of the Allied forces, let's say the British. So now, essentially, the Germans are fighting the British in Turkey, and the defense forces belong to the British. So the British would place a national flag down in Turkey to show that they are the new controller of that neutral nation, and if Germany did not win the battle and there were still defense forces left, the British would have the option to put a command token on the defense forces, at which point they would be able to move just as any other British unit and move out of the territory. But if say the British didn't have enough command tokens to place one on the defense forces, then it would just leave them without a command, and they would not leave Turkey. They could never be assigned orders until they were given a command. So then finally, let's talk about air carriers and carrier fighters, carrier fighter units. So there's a method that people have been using where they put the carrier fighter on top of the carrier, the parent carrier, and they return it after the battle, so that which is handy if you're remembering what, to launch them in the first place. But I've also seen people make the mistake or get confused and launch it a second time if there was a battle where the carrier was. So let's say, for example, the carrier's in a region, and initially the carrier launches to a separate region, engages in a battle, is shot down, and is lost, moved to the casualty list, and it should not, or even if it, that's fine because it's lost. But if it survived the battle in the other sea region, then after the battle, sometimes people have been moving the carrier fighter back to the carrier. And if there was also a battle where the carrier was, it would not participate in that battle because it can't be in two places at once. I'm not sure if that was too confusing, but that's why we say remove it from the map entirely, whether or not it was destroyed. Okay, so that's the 15 points I was going to go over for this video. We have an FAQ that we're working on, and that touches on rules for some endgame issues about collapsed nations, what happens and how those nations' territories are claimed by their allies or enemies. And I'm not going to get into that in this video, but that's coming up. And there are also a few other specific cases, questions that were asked that we answer. Some of them involve timing. Some of them, I'll go over this one, the civilian goods linked to industries. So we ruled that you do not need an industry in order to produce civilian goods. We at one time said yes, but we have now ruled that you do not. So China may still produce civilian goods, and they are produced immediately. So yeah, that's it for today. We might post another video answering the rest of the questions at another later date. I'm presuming more of these will come trickling in. And again, I recommend Board Game Geek to post your questions and answers so others can see the results. And yeah, that's it for today. We'll be also posting more information about Larry Harris's game that's in the works called Imperial Borders. There's some teaser videos that are out now, but we'll go into a little bit more depth in the coming weeks. That's it for now. Thanks. Bye.